like to share with you a conversation that I had with a Christian friend of mine a few months ago. After finding a couple verses that have the Bible giving God and Satan joint responsibility for a horrible atrocity, the death of 70,000, I decided to test my friend with these verses. Dude, these two quotes are a little confusing to me. The first one can be found in 2 Samuel 24:1, and it reads, "Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying to David, 'Go and count the people of Israel and Judah.'" The second verse can be found in 1 Chronicles 21:1, and that reads, "Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel." And in case you are not familiar with this counting of the people, it actually resulted in God sending a plague that kills 70,000 people, as taking a census was against God's commandments, at least if you didn't do it according to his, capricious rules and desires. See Exodus 30:11-16 for that. The big problem comes in the realization that the two passages refer to the exact same census. Yeah, I knew that these passages were so airtight, so problematic, that the only response I could expect from my friend would be a bullshit response, and that's in the philosopher Harry Frankfurt sense of the word. Thank you, Prof. MTH. I expected that my friend would end up making some strange appeal to the mysterious and unknowable ways of God, and that my friend's response went something like this. "Wow, I'm not a big fan of Bible contradictions, mostly because the contradiction is in the eye of the beholder. Most contradictions come from people that do not understand the text, person, place, time, etc. The next category that happens a lot, but not as often, is those that are open to interpretation, meaning with a certain interpretation there is no contradiction. The crux of the explanation for the inconsistency is really messengers. You might tell someone that you grabbed them a Coke at the store. In reality, your friend went in the store and bought it because you said you wanted to stay outside, but you would pay him back. It wouldn't be lying because the other friend was merely an extension of you. In this verse, Satan was an extension of God. The devil, of course, is a creation and so could be used as an extension. God used the devil. For whatever reason. I don't need to explain, justify, or excuse God's will. God used the devil to have David number the people. Is it just me, or does he think this is altogether just that easy to shove aside? I had not told him that I had found these two quotes in a book called The Birth of Satan, a book about the development of Satan over the writings of the Bible, written by T.J. Ray and Gregory Mobley. And in it they give historical, empirical analysis and explanation of why those two verses are different when describing presumably the same action. In short, the authors don't ignore person, place, and time. They don't. They accept that there is a historical context and that the Bible isn't in some kind of bubble that exempts it from the touches of history. Compare the explanatory power of the Christian statement to that of the authors of The Birth of Satan. They write, "The story of David's census is worth revisiting and discussing in more detail. The Bible contains two verses of the story. Both stories detail a census taken by David, a practice forbidden in the Torah, Exodus 30:11-16. Judging by the response, it would appear that God is deadly serious about the prohibition against numbering the people. In fact, a repentant David then builds an altar to the Lord." Now, we might be tempted to cite this tale as yet another example of God's punishing wrath, but the story contains much more. Although the stories in 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21 are very similar, there is one glaring difference. In the version presented in 2 Samuel 24, it is God who moved David to number the people. Quote, "Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go and count the people of Israel and Judah.' In the later version of the same story, however, it is not God who incites David to number the people, but Satan. Quote, Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. 1 Chronicles 21:1. Why does the author or authors of Chronicles change the instigator of census from God to Satan? The chronicler is retelling Israel's history, including a rehash of the story in 2 Samuel 24, through the lens of his own theology, and at a later date. The chronicler rewrites the events and, quote, updates them. For example, we know that the chronicler is concerned with the rehabilitation of David, whom he presents not as the politically brilliant but flawed king of Samuel and Kings, but as a sort of priestly leader who establishes Jerusalem as a center of worship. But if the chronicler is wont to admit some of David's more unsavory transgressions, for example, he makes no mention of David's exploitation of Bathsheba, 2 Samuel 11, then he is unable to gloss over David's census-taking. So how could he present this story in a more positive light? First, it is important to note one of the more striking aspects of the chronicler's version of events, specifically the terrifying wrath of Yahweh. When the author of Chronicles came to the census episode in his source book, 2 Samuel, he was confronted with an account of the deity at his most murderous, in the mode of his bipolarity farthest from, quote, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. This, of course, poses a problem for the chronicler, as he pens his account of the events, because the chronicler could not accept a Yahweh who inflicts both sin and punishment. The chronicler then reflects the growing existential frustration of monotheistic people who find it difficult to accept a God who is the author of both good and evil. Hence, in the chronicler's tale, it is not Yahweh but Satan who orders the census, and moreover, by assigning blame to Satan, the chronicler, in a stroke of sheer genius, is able to both restore David's integrity and keep Yahweh's reputation unblemished. The situation in my mind is as follows. The only way believers can explain the two verses is by saying that God used Satan to incite David to count the people and then proceeded to send a plague in punishment to kill 70,000 innocent people that had no choice in being counted. Something that I hope we can all consider immoral. And that claim is an incredible one that has to ignore all of the historical, personal, and social contexts of the verses in favor of some cheap, ad hoc appeal to the mysterious acts of God. When someone's happiness, faith, and comfort are on the line in front of actual brutal evidence, the evidence often suffers and is excluded in favor of explanations that bring up more problems than they answer. Part of the reason why Christianity and other religions are inherently illogical is because they are the accumulation of the thoughts of many men from many ages, each with their own prejudices reflecting and dominating their holy texts. To try to understand these texts as being one and unified and with a single message is to ask for absurdities and contradictions.